And what you can see here is that over the past 20 years, Korea started a very significant upward move from 1990 through 1995. Perhaps not surprisingly, given the conditions of the Asian financial crisis, stagnated between 95 and 2000 in its relative innovative capacity. But then the last decade, as best as we can tell from the data, has been a period of tremendous explosion of Korean innovative capacity, both in absolute terms and relative to the rest of the OECD. The second element, or excuse me, the final element of our triangle is regional entrepreneurship capacity. That's the capacity of a region not simply to have R&D workers work for large companies, but instead to undertake the kind of startup kind of activities that Saul described so eloquently. This is about our people, are they given incentives to go and work in a government lab or in a large company, or do they want to be risk takers and entrepreneurs? Is there risk capital available for not simply for basic research at the university or for a large product development project at a large manufacturer, but instead for a startup company, someone who's trying to do something new? Are there effective intellectual property laws that allow innovators to earn their rewards if they get them, or does all the value cede to the large established company? Ultimately, Korea, where Korea has done extremely well in terms of its innovative capacity, Korea has a more mixed record in terms of entrepreneurial capacity. The World Bank has a series of indicators that some of you may be familiar with, the doing business indicators. And in these, Korea does extremely well in some areas, for example, like trading across borders. It's essentially in a leadership position in the world. But it ranks at the number 60. So even though it has one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world, maybe 25th, it's at number 60 in terms of ease of starting a company. Israel, in contrast, ranks extremely highly on that dimension within these same indicators. Ultimately, we see that in the numbers when we look at least one measure of innovation output, at least the light bulb portion of the innovation output, patenting. Relative to Korean international patenting is very impressive, but is concentrated in a very small number of firms. Samsung, LG, Hynix, different parts of Samsung are ultimately the major chaebols are essentially account for more than 80% of the patenting that's going on in the Korean economy. Even though Korea has a tremendous, I think, culture for entrepreneurship, you see that in terms of the domestic retail establishments, in terms of kind of medium-sized businesses. We just haven't seen the rise of a venture capital-funded, risk capital-oriented entrepreneurial culture like we see in Israel, Boston, or Silicon Valley. Also, here the data that I was able to acquire was a bit more dubious, but let me just say that one thing that we also have seen is that the innovation activity also seems to be unusually highly concentrated within Korea, within the capital region. And perhaps that's not surprising, but is distinctive relative to other similar economies around the world. Ultimately, bringing together that triangle requires effective coupling of innovative and entrepreneurial capacity through a strong cluster environment, And to see that, I'll go through these relatively quickly, is to kind of talk about policy in a general way and then talk about it in the Korean context, is essentially why are we here? We are here to talk about how to lever clusters as an ingredient, as a driver of economic growth, and as a guide for economic strategy and policy. In some sense, we're trying to move from a world in which we thought about sectors and industries, where we thought about high-tech versus low-tech, were you picking kind of broadly the right industries, to instead focusing on the ability to exploit the comparative advantage realized in the latent clusters of the regional economy. That there are many paths to prosperity, and the crucial thing is not so much what you do, but how you do it. And that's the major challenge for Korea going forward. Ultimately, the economic case for cluster policy is about creating platforms for joint action, allowing the public sector and the private sector to be joined, and organizing public policy around clusters in a powerful way. Essentially, a cluster-oriented economic development strategy has many, many different facets, and it allows us to coordinate and synthesize the complementarities, spillovers latent throughout an economy. Clusters provide a framework for organizing the implementation of different types of policies, anywhere from export promotion to education and workforce to setting standards, which I know is quite important here, to to thinking about which investments we should be making in specialized physical infrastructure. Cluster initiatives, the underlying basis of how we make cluster policy, are the collaborative activities by groups of companies, public sector entities, and other institutions that have the objective to improve the competitiveness of interlinked economic activities within a specific geographic regions. Essentially, what's different about cluster-based economic policy is it brings together a whole bunch of ideas around complementarities to focus on how we upgrade productivity rather than simply how we focus on how to help out a single industry or even a single firm. Ultimately, that idea, how to essentially use clusters as a platform for economic strategy, allows us to position the Korean economic strategy more powerfully. Clusters ultimately are critical engines in the economic structure of regional economies. They essentially are a forum to identify the fundamental challenges in the regional business environment. And they provide new roles for governments, companies, and other institutions in economic development. So what should government do? And then we'll talk about Korea in particular. Government should support all existing and emerging clusters, participate, be the forum that brings together people, enable data collection and dissemination at the cluster level, allow us to understand those complementarities in a more systematic way that forces action, and be ready to implement recommendations that come from this emergent process. Sometimes, as we see here, where we do have a public-private partnership, government can powerfully initiate and convene forum that allows the members of a cluster to come together for common purpose. What shouldn't government do? Government shouldn't be in the business of choosing one cluster, and even worse, a single industry or single company that is favored. Governments are not particularly good at picking winners, and in some sense, cluster policy gives us an alternative that allows us to leverage comparative advantage without the mistakes of picking winners. Overall, Korea is well positioned to build on its strong record of economic performance and finalize its transition from an imitator to an innovative economy. The heart of Korean economic strength is its strong cluster environment, not simply leadership within a single industry. Korea has actually been fairly advanced and fairly sophisticated about leveraging complementarities and commonalities across a range of industries to realize a globally competitive position based not simply on cost, that was the 1980s, but on quality and innovation. However, very important reforms and initiatives remain. Specifically, if I had to think about one set of cluster development policies and cluster initiatives that we need to focus on within this forum, within Korea, is a need to focus on exactly the type of entrepreneurship that Saul was talking about. Impactful, globally competitive, startup risk capital. And in particular, what seems to be missing are the types of commercialization efforts that emerge at the university-industry interface that create companies that challenge the established order rather than simply being absorbed into established companies. While the leadership and innovative capacity and competitiveness of leading companies such as LG, such as Samsung, so on and so forth, such as Hyundai, are incredibly important and are incredibly We should be extremely proud of them within the Korean economic environment. An even better Korea is one where each of those companies and each of the divisions of those companies is being forced to compete on a more vigorous basis domestically on the basis of innovation. Despite important economic and social challenges and demographic challenges, Korea can lever its leadership in clusters to enhance educational and professional opportunities to all, to nurture a culture of innovation-driven entrepreneurship, and upgrade its leadership in a more convergent, more open global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the professor, for your wonderful presentation. The professor showed us a cluster as a key economic engine for the growth and the prosperity of the local economy. Now this concludes the official opening ceremony and the keynote addresses by Mr. Sausinger and the Professor Scott Stern. Now the luncheon will be served to you in the room 202 right next to this room. So you can continue on your discussion there. So still to come, the afternoon session will take place at room from 101 to 104 on the first floor of this building. The afternoon topic will include the green technology, convergence, and open innovation, innovation cluster, technology commercialization and funding, and what's to come more. So please join us for the afternoon session starting at 1:20 p.m. 네, 그럼 이것으로 제5회 국제혁신클러스터 컨퍼런스 개회식을 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 참석자분들께서는 행사장 맞은편 오찬장으로 이동해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 더불어 오찬 후 발표 세션이 1시 20분부터 1층 중회의장에서 시작될 예정입니다. 부디 5분 전 1시 15분까지 착석해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 감사합니다.